Despite the fact that there are still many gaps in history, historians argue that they have a good understanding of mankind's past in general. The events that took place in different countries and with different peoples, the sequence of these events, the names of rulers, and the biographies of entire dynasties are all known. In addition, scientists use many methods to try to clarify the details and dates of events and even restore unknown pages of history. Historians are convinced that history as a science primarily relies on historical documents, as well as on archaeological finds and preserved objects of material culture. In many ways this is true. However, not everything is so simple. As we showed in the second film of our documentary series, almost all traditional dating methods used today have significant shortcomings and limitations. Moreover, when determining the age of artifacts and objects of material culture using these methods, errors of hundreds and even thousands of years can occur. There are thousands of examples of incorrect dating, meaning that the traditional chronology of historical events cannot be considered entirely accurate. Therefore, it turns out that history itself is to a large extent a myth, fiction, and novel, and humanity knows much less about itself than is commonly thought. How, then, is it possible to discover the true history of mankind? How is it possible to uncover a way to reveal the truth? First, we will tell the story of one discovery. In the 1970s of the last century, the 20th century, the Russian mathematician Anatoly Timofeevich Fomenko worked on the problem of celestial mechanics. For these studies, the parameters of the moon's movement around the Earth are of great importance. Unexpectedly, Fomenko was faced with an interesting scientific work dealing with such studies. This work belonged to Robert Russell Newton, an American astrophysicist and mathematician, head of the NASA Data Center, who at that time was working on creating a space navigation network. The American scientist based his calculations on the dates of lunar eclipses taken from ancient chronicles. In these annals, there were 370 such eclipses. The American scientist analyzed them, performed the necessary calculations, and obtained a complete description of the movement of the natural satellite of our planet. Newton recorded the result in his scientific works, which ended up in Anatoly Fomenko's hands. According to the research of the American astrophysicist, it was discovered that radical changes occurred in the moon's movement from approximately 800 BC to 1000 AD. During this period of time, the moon began to move faster, and then its speed slowed down to normal values. Such a cataclysm cannot be explained in any way within the framework of Isaac Newton's mechanics and the modern gravitational theory of the moon's motion around the Earth. According to the laws of physics, the rotation speed of the Earth's satellite could not change so dramatically. So, what is the root cause? The American astrophysicist concluded that the actions of some mysterious force were to blame for all of this. What is this force? Why it never showed up again, Robert Newton could not explain. Moreover, the discussion on this problem, organized by the British Academy of Sciences in 1972, had failed to elucidate the situation in any way. The task intrigued the Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko, who decided to figure it out. Newton's calculations seemed to be correct, but the conclusion seemed rather strange. As a result, the solution was found where apparently no one thought to look. The calculations of the American astrophysicist were based on the dates of solar and lunar eclipses taken from ancient chronicles. Namely, they should have been checked in the first place. It was found that the dating of ancient eclipses can be inaccurate.
I once heard in the corridors of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics about a remarkable Russian scientist, Nikolai Morozov, who, as I heard from these stories, expressed the opinion that the old eclipses were apparently incorrectly dated and should be redated. He published his results in a famous book, 7 volumes, entitled Christ. I asked to bring me this volume, which contains his eclipse recalculation tables. I did see the new dates proposed by Nikolai Morozov for eclipses, including those from antiquity, the early and late Middle Ages. Then, I did the following. I took Robert Newton's algorithm and kept everything except the eclipse dates. I inserted the new dates proposed by Nikolai Morozov into this algorithm and repeated Newton's calculations. After that, it turned out that the graph became a constant line on the time axis. The strange, amazing effect disappeared, the leaps disappeared, and there was no need to invent some mysterious forces in the Earth-Moon system. Thus, I solved a very interesting and non-trivial problem of celestial mechanics.
The calculations made by Robert Newton and the first justified suspicions became the beginnings of a great scientific research. Having carefully studied the dating methods used by historians and archaeologists, as well as all the works of Nikolai Morozov, Anatoly Fomenko concluded that not only the dates of eclipses are wrong, but ancient chronicles may also contain unreliable information. One must start from the very basics to verify this. It is known that the traditional version of the chronology was proposed by the French philologist, publisher and commentator of ancient texts Joseph Scaliger in the second half of the 16th century. In his work, Study on the Improvement of Time, he described the chronologies of different peoples and is believed to have brought them into line with each other. He was also the first to apply the method of astronomically dating of events by eclipse. Almost 4 centuries later, Anatoly Fomenko discovered that the medieval method was imperfect, and moreover, it was used with serious errors. So he set out to find new, more accurate ways of dating historical events. Only in this way can the true chronology of world history be reconstructed. Fomenko's opponents appeared immediately. Evidently, the first were historians.
Different representatives will attend and have a word. Those who spoke before me were wrong. It was not Morozov who laid the foundation. Newton started with his 2 descriptions. And Newton, Isaac Newton, is the greatest scientist. Scientist number 1. History is not a chronological outline and a sequence of events. It is a process, a complex process. Action, components associated with the system. I must state with full responsibility that everything in the works of Anatoly Timofeevich Fomenko relating to ancient Russian history has nothing to do with either mathematical methods or mathematics in general.
Historians have claimed that finding dates and collecting documentary evidence are the realms of history, not mathematics. However, this behavior of historians was incorrect. As a science, chronology appeared only in the 16th century AD and has long been a branch of applied mathematics. It's understandable why. It was mathematicians who were engaged in astronomical calculations, assessing their accuracy, and decoding old texts. It was quite logical that in the 20th century a mathematician decided to check the accuracy of these calculations. Anatoly Fomenko began this work in 1973, and within 8 years he developed new dating methods. In those years, he worked almost solely. But fortunately, later he had people who shared his opinions. work began to move forward much more quickly. With the help of his supporters, Anatoly Fomenko successfully develops previously created methods, as well as creating new mathematical and statistical dating methods. In recent years, several methods have been created in collaboration with mathematician Gleb Vladimirovich Nozovsky.
In 1981, my co-author Gleb Vladimirovich Nozovsky appeared, and together we created another new method in addition to those I created from 1973 to 1980. Then we began working together with Vladimir Vyacheslavovich Kalashnikov and my wife Tatiana Nikolaevna Fomenko. Here is a team that has been formed many years ago, and we have been working together since then. Unfortunately, Kalashnikov is no longer with us, so Nozovsky, Tatiana Nikolaevna Fomenko, and I are mainly carrying out the latest work.
The mathematical methods developed by Fomenko, Nozovsky, and Kalashnikov are precise scientific instruments. With their help, one can check almost any historical documents, annals, maps, biographies of royal dynasties. Following certain rules, any document can be formalized. It becomes a kind of statistical unit and is carefully cross-analyzed using several methods and tools. One does not need to be a mathematician to understand how these unique methods work. We will not use numerous formulas and calculations and will deliberately simplify our story in order to show the main thing, the essence of these methods. Is it even possible to compare different texts? Sure, one can. Everyone would answer, as any text has its own specific meaning. And if we compare not just texts, but historical documents? For example, different chronicles at first glance appear to describe completely different events that took place in different countries and different eras. But what if, in fact, they tell about the same historical event? It turns out that this is possible. But how do we recognize it? Certainly, we can determine if these texts are interconnected or not by their meaning. However, one cannot always evaluate information objectively. He may be hindered by stereotypes instilled in childhood. But if you do not rely on subjective opinions, then how do you check whether texts speak about the same period of history or about different ones?
It often happens that two descriptions appear to be completely different. It is such a completely different situation. The two chronicles are allegedly vastly different. However, according to mathematical analysis, they turn out to be very close for some reason.
If you have two unknown keys in your hands, how can you tell if they are the same or different? The easiest way to tell is to insert the keys into the lock. But what if this is not possible? The person simply compares the tooth profile drawings. If they match, then the keys are identical. Maybe it sounds incredible, but you can also compare the texts the same way. To do this, they must each be presented in the form of a graph and then compared. But how to do that? Each historical text describes events in a certain sequence, namely, by year. This means that it can be divided into certain segments, for example, 1 year per segment. Then we look at how much textual material refers to each year, that is, to each segment. You can count the number of pages of text, lines, or characters. The main thing is to get a number characterizing the volume of the text. Years are marked on the x-axis horizontally. On the vertical y-axis, we mark the obtained numbers for the volume of the material. For example, the description of the first year in this text takes 3 pages, the second 5, the third none. It could happen so, the fourth 10, and so on. We build the same graph for the second text. These two zigzag lines with a large number of toothing are the forms of the texts, and the form can already be compared. Peaks, that is, the upper points of the teeth, are called local maxima by mathematicians, and the method itself has been given such a name, the local maxima method. In this method, the resulting graphs are compared point by point. In this case, the height of the points on the graphs does not play a special role. What is important is whether the years of bursts coincide on the timeline. If the locations of the bursts coincide, then the profiles of both graphs turn out to be dependent. The method was tested on several dozen texts, and each time it proved to be effective. It turned out that if the texts discuss the same flow of events, the bursts on the charts occur almost simultaneously. Such a coincidence can be found by comparing, for example, two texts, The History of Rome, by the ancient Roman historian Titus Livius, and Essays on the History of Ancient Rome, by the Soviet historian Vladimir Sergeyev. The forms of these texts make bursts almost simultaneously. It turns out that we are talking about the same events. In this case, it is quite clear from the text. Both books are about ancient Rome. Let's use this method to consider chronicles that tell of supposedly disparate events and date back to different years. This is the tale of bygone years, believed to have been written in the 10th-11th century. And this is the Nikiforov manuscript, which according to the historian, was written in the 14th-15th centuries. Historians claim that these documents are separated by almost 4 centuries and describe completely different events. But the graphs of these annals unexpectedly coincide with each other. The strict mathematical calculations prove that we are likely talking about the same historical time. This means that the age of one of the documents has been incorrectly identified, and the discrepancy is between 300 and 400 years. There are quite a few examples like this.
Therefore, only with the help of a method of statistical mathematics, it is possible to objectively analyze old texts. Without them, it is unfortunately impossible to construct a chronology.
If a person sees that the outlines of the keys are the same, he makes the only correct conclusion. These keys open the same lock, and they persistently try to convince him that the keys are different. Will he believe? Hardly. The truth in this case is obvious for him and is corroborated by evidence. Ancient geographical maps can also tell a lot of interesting things. After all, what is a map? This is humanity's idea of the world at the time it was created. It is natural to assume that it all started with primitive schemes that bear little resemblance to maps as we know them. As navigation developed, wars were fought, trade relations were established, and new information about lands and countries emerged. This information was very important for every country. Therefore, it was necessarily applied to the maps, and with each era, the maps became more and more accurate and perfect. Here is an example of a very rare map from 1522, compiled by Occupario. Europe and Asia are very different from modern representations. Greenland is depicted as a peninsula of Europe. The Black Sea is skewed vertically. The Caspian Sea is almost unrecognizable, and China is absent altogether. The map of Cornelius Nicholas from 1598 also suffers from distortions, but there are far fewer of them than on the preceding map. This is a unique monument of European cartography, the Big Globe of Blau, made by the renowned Dutch company Blau at the end of the 17th century, commissioned by King Charles XI of Sweden. It can be seen with the naked eye that it is much closer to reality than previous maps were. The outlines of the continents have become much more accurate. Many new lands have appeared. This example clearly shows that with each subsequent map, the number of correct geographical information increased and the number of erroneous ones decreased. It is similar to how children draw as they grow up. A 6-year-old kid will draw the world around him very simply and naively. Trees are sticks, people are round, disproportionately large flowers, and fabulous animals. In the drawing of a 10-year-old child, the proportions become more realistic, people appear more or less lifelike, and most likely there will be no fairy tale characters at all. And finally, a 16-year-old teenager will attempt to draw all the details, movements, and eyes. It is almost impossible to confuse the sequence of these drawings. It is possible to compare geographic maps in the same way. However, for serious research, visual comparison alone is not sufficient. It is necessary to obtain scientific confirmation. The Anatoly Fomenko's method allowing doing this is called the method of correct chronological ordering and dating of ancient geographical maps. Let's take a few old maps. For example, Schedel's map, which historians believe was issued in 1493. A map of Peter Apian, allegedly from 1520. Map of Solinus, 1538 issue. And a map from the Atlas of Mercator Hondius from 1607. Each map will be assigned a serial number depending on the official date of its inception. Next, it is necessary to get a complete description of each map. To do this, a table is compiled in which all the information about the map is entered. Is the map flat, or is it a globe, a world map, or a regional one? The table must include the locations of the poles, the equator, climatic zones, a description of the seas, countries, etc. Anatoly Fomenko referred to this table of geographical features as a map code. In fact, it is a formalized map model. The same tables are compiled for the rest of the maps selected for comparison. Now the collected information allows for plotting a graph. On the horizontal axis, we mark the serial number of the map. On the vertical axis, the number of incorrect features of the map. Let's say there are 24 of them. With each new map, incorrect features that do not correspond to real geography will gradually decrease, while those that are correct, such as a straight or an exact outline of the coast, will remain. Thus, the total number of incorrect features will decrease and the graph will show a downward curve.
Then the same method was applied to maps of antiquity and the early Middle Ages. It turned out that the emerging dates are absolutely not consistent with what we know from modern tables. For example, the famous maps of Ptolemy, supposedly antique maps of the 2nd century AD, fell around the 15th-16th century AD, moved up along the timeline by at least 1,000 years. Further, say the maps of Hesiod and Euclid also turned out to be by no means from the 5th, 3rd century BC, but also fell into the Middle Ages, in the period of the 12th, 13th centuries of the Common Era. The famous Putinger map, an ancient map of the Roman Empire, also moved up along the timeline and ended up approximately in the 15th century AD.
We are looking at the famous map of Hans Rust from 1480. It is evident that this is not even a map, but merely a pleasant drawing. In principle, this corresponds to the development of cartography in the 15th century. Now, for comparison, let's take one of the purported ancient maps of Ptolemy. The contradiction is obvious. The map, supposedly from the 2nd century AD, corresponds to the idea of the geography of the Columbus era. It turns out that long before the 15th century, in antiquity, mankind created detailed pictorial maps of a fairly high level. Then it suddenly lost all knowledge and skills and reverted to primitive schemes. However, no global catastrophes have been experienced by humankind. Its development did not cease, and new generations did not have to relearn the world from scratch. Then, where did the supposedly ancient origin of sufficiently realistic geographical maps come from? Historians themselves cannot explain this paradox in the development of cartography. However, the explanation is provided by Fomenko's method of ordering geographical maps. It is this method that makes it possible to calculate the true time of appearance of the so-called ancient Ptolemy maps. They were created no earlier than the 15th-16th centuries AD. And this means that in traditional chronology not just negligence was made. The error is hundreds, and sometimes thousands of years. It is unlikely that anyone would believe that a small child, who had just learned to hold a pencil in his hand, could draw an accurate and vivid portrait of a person. And then, instead of creating new paintings, he began to draw gnarled stick trees and disproportionately large flowers again. Such a sequence is unlikely. Most likely, the children's drawings just got mixed up. This is the only explanation. Among historians, there has long been an opinion that sometimes chroniclers attributed to their contemporary rulers the qualities and deeds of some other, long-deceased ancient kings. Traditional history assures us that such a strange fascination with antiquity among the chroniclers was widespread. Because of this, quite a lot of similar biographies of ancient rulers appeared in history. To identify such repetitions, it is not enough to just study a large number of historical biographies. The information received must be organized somehow. For this, Anatoly Fomenko developed a table, which he called the form code. In the form of such a questionnaire, one can write down any biographical account, and then examine it objectively, disregarding the subjective assessments of the chroniclers. The form code consists of 34 fields and contains detailed information about the ruler, his gender, lifespan, period of reign, his status, e.g. emperor, commander, religious leader, cause of death of the ruler, natural disasters, astronomical phenomena, wars, conspiracies, and much more that happened during his reign. Anatoly Fomenko did an immense task. He compiled form codes for several hundred major ancient rulers. Now it is enough to just take any form code and compare it with others. It is significant that with the help of this method it is possible to compare not only individual chronicle biographies, but also entire dynasties of rulers. Let's choose 2 dynasties for comparison. From each dynasty, we will choose, for example, 20 form codes of kings who ruled sequentially, that is, one after another. Anatoly Fomenko referred to this sequence as the flow of form codes. Initially, the form codes of the first ruler of one dynasty and the first ruler of another dynasty are compared. Then the form codes of the subsequent ruler of the first dynasty and the subsequent ruler of the second dynasty are compared, and so on. With such a comparison, it is important to note that if only 2 compared biographies are similar, it does not necessarily mean anything. There are many such similar biographies throughout history. It is quite clear that no chronological conclusions should be drawn from this. To calculate how close 2 dynasties are to each other, Anatoly Fomenko developed a special coefficient. It is used to compare each pair of form codes. For better clarity of comparison, the flows of form codes can be depicted graphically. Let's mark the serial number of each ruler of the first dynasty we have chosen horizontally, and the time of his reign in years vertically. Fomenko refers to this as the dynasty's profile. Such a profile can be built for any ruling family and will uniquely belong to that family, which will always be identifiable by this profile. We construct a similar graph for the second dynasty. Now the resulting graphs can be compared. If the profiles of two dynasties differ little from one another, then they depict the same real dynasty. This Fomenko's method is based on the principle of small distortions. The mathematician calculated that although the chroniclers sometimes made mistakes in the duration of the reign of kings, these mistakes were not significant. Consequently, the profiles obtained on the basis of chronicles can be considered very individual. From birth, every person has attributes that distinguish them from all other people on the planet. They distinguish him not only from contemporaries, but also from those who have lived or will live. How to determine whether the same person is depicted in 3 photographs or they are completely different people? The names are different, the biographies are different, the documents are also different. Physical resemblance? One can, however, change their appearance, dye hair, stick a mustache and beard, and even get plastic surgery. But DNA and fingerprints cannot be changed, they are individual and unique. Therefore, having a sufficient database, it is always possible to find out what kind of person is hiding behind a new appearance and a new name. The profile of a dynasty calculated by mathematicians is like fingerprints or human DNA. And if all of a sudden a new, allegedly unknown dynasty is discovered in some historical document, its profile can be recreated and compared with profiles from the database. This graphic depicts profiles of 2 ruling dynasties, the ancient kingdom of Judah from the 6th–1st century BC and the Eastern Roman Empire from the 4th–7th centuries AD. And these are the profiles of the ruling dynasties of the medieval Holy Roman Empire of the 10th–13th centuries and the medieval Habsburg Empire of the 13th–17th centuries. If these profiles are placed on opposite sides of the axis, they are almost symmetrical. What happens? Do they belong to the same dynasty? Visual similarity should be verified. To do this, the probability of coincidence of these pairs of dynasties can be calculated. It turns out that it is negligible. There is about 1 chance in 100 billion that 2 different dynasties of kings in 2 different countries were as similar to each other as 2 peas. In the official history, there were quite a few of such dynastic twins.
Pairs of dynasties were discovered that are now considered completely different and which ruled in different countries during different eras. Say, one dynasty ruled in ancient Rome, while another ruled in medieval Europe. Nevertheless, our method unexpectedly showed that the reign graphs of these dynasties were strikingly similar, as close as knowingly dependent pairs of dynasties. We referred to such pairs as duplicates or phantoms. There were quite a few of them, several dozen.
This method demonstrated that some ruling dynasties were merely reproduced in history, reproduced only on paper. How could this happen? Most likely for 2 reasons. Firstly, mistakes could have occurred due to the lack of consideration caused by the poor development of science at that time. For example, ancient documents described the same dynasty, and the interpreters of these texts concluded that they were referring to completely different rulers. Therefore, they gave them new names and transferred them not only to other countries but also to other eras. Secondly, and more importantly, such errors were deliberate. It was important for some powerful forces of the Middle Ages to rewrite history, hiding something very important for their descendants and other peoples. We will discuss this in detail in the following films. The discovery of duplicates of the dynasty of rulers leads to new thoughts. Most likely, not all chronicles that have come down to us have set out the events in the exact chronological order in which they actually occurred. The chronicler, when describing the events, necessarily mentions the kings and significant people of his era. It is their character and actions that interest him most. It is very important for the chronicler that nothing gets mixed up, and so he tries to describe his heroes as accurately as possible. Each person has a separate name. These names of historical characters are the best guide when analyzing a text. A personal diary can tell a lot about its owner. Here, for example, are the records of the boy Petya. He went to school and was friends with Vanya and Masha. The names of Vanya and Masha are found literally on every page and more than once. Gradually, records about them become less and less frequent, and it's understandable why. Petya graduated from high school and entered the university. He has a different life and new friends. He sees Vanya and Masha much less often, and towards the end of the notebook their names completely disappear. This is also understandable. Petya graduated from the university, started working, got a family and no longer cares about his school friends. The same logic holds true for chronicles. Each new generation gives birth to new heroes. Therefore, as the chronicler describing generations moves from one to another, he also changes characters in his narrative. This simple principle proved useful for creating a dating method. To check whether the chronological order of events in the annals is not violated, we will construct a graph. On the horizontal axis, we mark the sequence of parts of the text, and on the vertical axis, we indicate the number of all messages about all historical figures first mentioned in some part of the annals. If the events are described in the correct chronological order, the graph will decline, looking something like this. Such a graph can be plotted for each part of the chronicle and for each character mentioned in it. For this principle, Anatoly Fomenko coined the term frequency dumping principle, and the associated method is the method for ordering historical texts chronologically. Repeated tests on historical documents of the 17th-20th centuries fully confirmed it. So, the history of this epoch is really the way everyone knows it. But as soon as we turn to earlier chronicles, incredible things begin. The graphs of ancient chronicles, constructed using Fomenko's method, very often give an angled line with unexpected bursts instead of a decreasing curve. That is, the names of long-forgotten historical characters appear with the same frequency. And this is not historical nonsense. These are parts of the chronicle, transferred from the present to the past. If you return them to their correct place, the graph of the text will take on the correct form, a curve going down. If the last pages of Petya's diary only tell of long-forgotten school friends, what does this mean? Has Petya suddenly forgotten everyone around him? Does he no longer communicate with college friends and work colleagues, does not make new acquaintances, and is there only Vanya and Masha in his life? It's hard to believe. Most likely, this page simply fell out of the beginning of the diary and inadvertently ended up at the end of the notebook. The examples we have described clearly show how the pages of human history are mixed up. The chronology of this history is not just broken somewhere. As it turns out, it requires a total and careful review. What needs to be done to see all the contradictions of the generally accepted historical version? Perhaps it is necessary to compile a global chronological map of the entire traditional history? At first glance, this seems impossible, but, nevertheless, this task turned out to be feasible. Anatoly Timofeevich Fomenko decided to figure out how world history really looks like. To do this, he did a colossal job, studied hundreds of ancient texts, tables, annals, chronicles, analyzed the ancient and medieval history of Europe, Egypt, the Middle East, the Mediterranean. He studied most of the documents that describe the main events of human history that took place over a period of 6,000 years, from the year 4000 BC to 1900 AD. To present this information visually, Anatoly Fomenko compiled a document which had no analogues yet. The scientist worked on it for 6 years. He depicted all the collected information in the form of a large chronological scale stretched along the horizontal time axis. It indicated exactly the dates that Scaliger and Petavius, the founders of the traditional history, insisted on. First, the map was displayed on graph paper. Then it was scanned and the image was transferred onto a special material. This unique document is extraordinary in its size. The map is 19 meters long. Thus, for the first time, a graphic representation of history that is studied in schools and universities was created.
Tens of thousands of names, many thousands of dates, information about civil unrests, important books, primary sources, chronicles, their dating, the authors of the chronicle, chroniclers, astronomers, etc. were depicted on the map in their due places. Then techniques developed by me and my colleagues, which I spoke about briefly, were applied to this material. And I marked duplicates on this map, that is, those epochs that turned out to be close, similar, dependent according to these methods.
How was it done? Anatoly Fomenko divided the entire world history into epochs. Then each epoch was displayed in detail on the timeline. Events that took place simultaneously in different countries were depicted one above the other. To demonstrate multiple repetitions of historical events that exist in traditional history, Fomenko assigned different letters to different time intervals. For example, the era of the Second Rome was marked with the letter K. All of its duplicates, which Fomenko discovered using his methods, were marked with the same letter. Other historical eras, as well as their duplicates, were indicated by other letters, such as S and P, and were also marked on the map. Thus, a scheme showing how repetitions of historical events are located on the timeline took shape. This map was referred to as the Global Chronological Map. It is this map that shows what the true chronology of historical events should be. It became apparent that there were 3 major chronological shifts in traditional history, roughly 300, 1000, and 1800 years. Many real historical events from the Middle Ages were multiplied on paper by medieval chroniclers and sent to the past. How could this have happened if the chroniclers of the Middle Ages made a mistake unintentionally? Let's take 4 ancient chronicles. They all describe the same events that took place, for example, in Europe in the 15th century. However, the fact remains that the authors of these chronicles lived not only in different countries, but even at different times. They spoke and wrote in different languages, used different chronologies. It is not surprising that, narrating about the same king, city, or battle, they gave them completely different names. Therefore, when the chroniclers of the 16th, 18th centuries read these chronicles, they decided that it was about 4 totally distinct eras. Instead of placing these chronicles on the timeline one above the other, they arranged them sequentially, that is, one after the other. They left one chronicle in the 15th century, the second was pushed back 300 years, the third back 1,000 years, and the fourth was sent back 1,800 years. They stitched all them together, and a very long chronology was created.
Only with the help of the method of statistical mathematics one can truly objectively analyze old texts. Without them, unfortunately, it is impossible to construct a chronology. Therefore, no true chronology had been created before us. It was based on very subjective interpretation of methods. Until the methods of mathematics and statistical astronomy are fully integrated into history, until then history will remain a science that is purely subjective and built on a very shaky foundation.
We can say that today the project New Chronology of Fomenko-Nozovsky consists of two parts. The first part is the new mathematical methods for studying old texts and maps, as well as a chronological map compiled for the first time, the New Chronological Map. This map was created on the basis of a cross-checking of ancient historical texts and maps using all developed methods. The second part is a presumed reconstruction of history based on the new chronology. Having restored the real chronology, mathematicians Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky realized that it was necessary to recreate the entire world history, as traditional history was based on an incorrect chronology. Fomenko was supported by other renowned scientists. His research began to attract attention of colleagues not only in Russia but also abroad. In Germany, such studies were carried out by Yevgeny Gabovich, a mathematician, historian, and writer. His works on historical analytics essentially developed the theory of Anatoly Fomenko.
When I talk about the Russian New Chronology, well, we often call it the New Chronology of Fomenko and Nozovsky. I use the term chronological revolution. And I have high expectations that the history of philological, traditional, ideological, and other lies about the past, which do not describe the past, but at best describe some kind of virtual past, can eventually turn into a kind of science about the past, which I urge you to call pastology.
Alexander Alexandrovich Zinoviev is an outstanding Russian philosopher and writer, a professional logician. Having studied the works of Fomenko and Nozovsky, he immediately became their supporter.
When I got acquainted with the book of Fomenko and Nozovsky, I was simply shocked. I must tell you, simply shocked. I was shocked. I was delighted. I literally walked for several days under the impression of this work. And for the first time in my life, I had to face a truly great scientific discovery, and I experienced pleasure.
I think that Anatoly Timofeevich is the most brilliant scientist. It is indisputable, and he is one of the brightest figures of the 20th-21st centuries, one of the outstanding figures, comparable only to Giordano Bruno, Galileo, and so on. At the same time, both Newton and Morozov were obviously engaged in chronology, new chronology or real chronology. But it was certainly him who presented the system analysis, scientific, methodological, mathematical calculation.
The results of the work of mathematicians Fomenko and Nozovsky are astounding. New methods have helped to find answers to questions that historians still consider unsolvable. With their help, it was possible to discover historical facts that were previously unknown. For example, it turned out that Russian history had been drastically altered. If the European and Asian chronology were artificially lengthened, then the Russian one, on the contrary, was shortened and significantly distorted. Fomenko's methods made it possible to establish that many very famous historical figures did not actually exist. It turned out that they were only historical doubles, phantoms of other real historical figures. It is sad to admit, but it turns out that for many years humanity has been dealing with a great historical hoax. All events allegedly taking place before the 10th century AD were phantom reflections of the actual events of the Middle Ages, that is, the 11th-17th centuries AD. They were incorrectly dated and passed off as being the real history of mankind. Therefore, the work of the authors of the New Chronology Project is of great scientific importance.
I believe that this discovery is one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. And if we take the sphere of historical research, then this is the most significant discovery in the entire process of understanding mankind's past.
In the following films of the documentary series, History, Science or Fiction, we will detail how the true history of mankind looks like, according to Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nozovsky. The picture turned out to be astounding, unexpected and even shocking to some. Civilizations left us not only many historical monuments, but also many mysteries. One of them is the mystery of the Egyptian pyramids. How were these majestic structures built? How did ancient architects process and move huge stone blocks? Is the mystery of ancient Egypt still unsolved? Find out in our next film, Alchemy of the Pyramids, or how they used to build in ancient Egypt.
Thank you.